A single aircraft forced an entire American fleet to pull back farther from foreign shores. And that is a documented fact of military planning, not a legend. Its name was spoken in a low voice inside NATO command rooms. It was written into international treaties on a separate line, as if the matter concerned not a machine, but an entire army. And to stop it, diplomats had to sit down at the negotiating table and literally cut away part of its capabilities, with a stroke of the pen, without touching the metal. How does a steel mass weighing hundreds of tons slip past modern radar? Why does it need wings that change their shape in mid-flight, like a living creature? And why can just one of its sorties decide the fate of a carrier group within mere minutes? But all of this is merely the shell. Watch to the end, and you will understand why it was kept silent for so long. We will not waste a moment. Let us begin. The year 1949 turned the global balance upside down overnight. The Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device, and the long-held monopoly of a single superpower crumbled into dust. But here is the bitter truth that people preferred to keep quiet in those years. Having a bomb and being able to deliver it to its target are two entirely different matters. And the second one proved to be a far crueler problem than the first. For 3 decades to come, it robbed Soviet strategists of any peaceful sleep. While Moscow celebrated nuclear parity, across the ocean a very different trump card was being forged. The United States was rapidly expanding its fleet, and this was no ordinary fleet. These were floating fortresses, carrier strike groups, a concentration of combat power the world had never seen before. At the center of each group stood an aircraft carrier, its deck loaded with dozens of combat machines, while cruisers and destroyers circled around it, forming a wall of steel. Such an armada could appear at any point of the world ocean within just 3 or 4 days, and there was nothing to set against it. This is directly tied to the rawest nerve of that era. By the middle of the 1960s, the United States already had more than 10 such groups, and that is not some dry figure from a reference book. It meant that the shores of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East had fallen under the constant aim of American carrier aviation. An aircraft carrier is not merely a ship, it is an instrument that decides who rules the sky over any coastal region of the planet. And at that moment, this decision was not being made in Moscow. Soviet strategists saw the problem in all its merciless nakedness. Land-based aviation simply could not keep pace. By the time an aircraft took off from a coastal airfield and reached a carrier group in the open ocean, that group had already shifted into another sector and dissolved into the boundless water. Submarines were effective, no argument there, but their reaction time was far too slow for a moving target of this class. Something fundamentally different was required. This is directly tied to the very root of the entire design race that followed. What was needed was an aircraft that possessed not merely high speed, not merely long range, not merely devastating armament. What was needed was a machine that combined all of it at once, every quality pushed to the limit of what the era could offer. First, speed. Enough to break away from the escort fighters that would rise from the carrier deck to intercept it. Second, range. Enough to operate far from its own shores, over foreign seas, in places where there were no friendly airfields and no friendly cover. And third, striking power. Enough for a single strike to decide the outcome of a confrontation with an entire group of warships. Not to damage, not to bruise, to decide. This is directly tied to the cruelest paradox of that assignment. No such aircraft existed anywhere in the world at that time, not in the Soviet Union, not in the United States, not in Britain, not in France. Designers on both sides of the Iron Curtain ran into the same wall. The qualities demanded by military doctrine contradicted one another at the level of physics itself. A fast machine lost range, a long-range machine lost speed, and heavy armament killed both at once. And yet, there was nowhere to retreat. The ocean would not wait. American carrier groups kept plowing the waters right up against the borders, and every month of delay cost more than the one before. The Soviet military machine stood before a task easy to speak aloud and nearly impossible to solve at the drawing board: to create the impossible. It was from this deadlock that the story began, the story that would carry one of the most formidable bombers of the 20th century into the sky. In the late 1950s, Soviet designers worked with what they had at hand, and what they had was the Tu-22M jet bomber, a solid, reliable machine, well proven in the regiments. It had taken to the sky back in 1952, and for its time, was a true breakthrough. Two turbojet engines, a swept wing, a top speed of around 1,050 kilometers per hour, a range of up to 6,000 kilometers. By the standards of the early 50s, an outstanding aircraft. The Tu-22M was built by the hundreds. It served in aviation regiments across the entire Soviet Union. It was feared, it was a source of pride, and it honestly did its job. But an era knows no sentimentality. By the end of the 50s, military strategists began to notice what was awkward to say out loud. The Tu-22M was growing obsolete. And not because it had become worse, but because the adversary had become stronger. This is directly tied to the brutal arithmetic of that race. New generation American interceptors, such as the Convair F-106 Delta Dart, by 1960 were confidently exceeding 2,000 kilometers per hour. Yet the cruising speed of the Tu-22M did not even reach 900. A meeting between such a bomber and such an interceptor over the open ocean ended predictably. It could not escape. That was pure mathematics, not anyone's subjective opinion. Altitude was taken away too. High-altitude flight had, only a decade earlier, been considered a relatively safe refuge. Now it had turned into a lethal risk. This was vividly confirmed by the incident with the American reconnaissance aircraft U-2 over Soviet territory in 1960. High-altitude invulnerability proved to be a myth. Surface-to-air missile systems were growing more accurate and longer-ranged with every passing year. The sky had stopped forgiving those who lagged behind. This is directly tied to a decision Soviet aviation made on the move. The answer was supposed to be the Tu-22. The Tupolev Design Bureau unveiled it in 1958, and outwardly it was a machine of an entirely unfamiliar appearance. Its two engines were placed not beneath the wings, as on its predecessor, but at the base of the tail assembly, on either side of the fin. This solution freed the wing of slung nacelles and gave a cleaner, more streamlined form. A delta wing, a sharp nose, an aggressive modern silhouette. On paper, it looked like a step into the future. At top speed, the Tu-22 accelerated to roughly 1,500 kilometers per hour, noticeably livelier than the Tu-22M. But as usual, the devil hid in the details, and there turned out to be 3 of them, each striking at the most painful spot. This is directly tied to the first affliction, range. The practical range of the Tu-22 was around 4,900 kilometers, less than that of the Tu-22M it was meant to replace. For a machine being prepared to work over the ocean, where the reckoning runs into thousands of kilometers of empty water, this was not a flaw but a death sentence for half of its missions. An aircraft that cannot reach its target is useless, no matter how fast it flies. The second affliction lay hidden in its behavior at low speeds. On landing, the Tu-22 demanded a very high approach speed, on the order of 290, even 300 kilometers per hour. For comparison, a modern civilian airliner approaches the runway at around 240 to 260. The difference seems small only on paper. In practice, it meant the pilot had no right to error at all. This is directly tied to the reputation the Tu-22 earned among pilots. The machine was unforgiving. It did not pardon imprecision, it did not pardon fatigue, it did not pardon a single second of distraction on the landing course. Over the years of service, aviation lost several such machines for exactly this reason, not in combat, but in ordinary training flights. The aircraft turned out to be a demanding overseer that punished the slightest weakness. And the third affliction, the most unpleasant one for military planners, the anti-ship missions, the very reason the whole thing had been started. The main weapon of the Tu-22 was the heavy missile Kh-22, but to launch it effectively, the aircraft had to reach a certain altitude and speed, and at that very moment it found itself right inside the engagement zone of the ship's surface-to-air missile systems. The carrier exposed itself to a strike exactly when it was preparing to strike. This is directly tied to the central conclusion of that era. The equation would not add up. By the middle of the 60s, it had become obvious. The Tu-22 was not the solution to the problem. Important, necessary, but merely an intermediate stage, a step rather than the summit. And then the question rose to its full height, the one that set the designer's teeth on edge. How does one create a machine that works equally confidently at both low and supersonic speeds, takes off from an ordinary runway without demanding jeweler's precision from the pilot, and yet at high altitude accelerates to a speed twice that of sound? Two requirements that contradicted each other at the level of physics itself. And someone had to break that contradiction. When engineers first set this contradiction down on paper, the solution looked plainly impossible. An aircraft with a wing tuned for supersonic flight behaves abominably at low speeds. An aircraft with a wing convenient for takeoff and landing will never reach supersonic speed without monstrous losses. One machine could not be good in both regimes at once, so decreed physics, and no one knew how to argue with it. To grasp the catch, one has to understand what actually happens to an aircraft at different speeds. At low speeds, on takeoff, landing, flight near the ground, the machine needs a wide wing. A wide wing generates great lift and lets it fly slowly without stalling. That is precisely why airliners deploy their flaps before landing. They artificially increase the area and curvature of the wing. At supersonic speed, everything is turned on its head. That very wide wing which saved the day on takeoff now generates monstrous air resistance. The machine is like a man trying to run a 100-meter dash with an open umbrella in his hands. For supersonic flight, you need the exact opposite wing, narrow, swept, pressed as tightly as possible against the fuselage. Minimal frontal section, minimal resistance. Two flight regimes, two mutually exclusive types of wing, and yet one single aircraft. And then someone uttered a phrase that broke all the old logic. What if the wing should not be the same in both cases at all? What if it were made movable, mechanically changing its angle of sweep right in flight, spreading it wide for takeoff and landing, folding it narrow for the supersonic dash? Take a sheet of paper, fold it lengthwise. It becomes narrow and rigid. Unfold it, wide and pliable again. A crude simplification, yet this very thought became the foundation of one of the most elegant engineering solutions in all of 20th century aviation. A wing with variable sweep. It sounds deceptively simple. In reality, it is one of the most difficult problems ever solved in aircraft construction. The idea itself was not new. Aerodynamicists had been discussing it since the late 1940s. But it is one thing to draw arrows on paper, and quite another to embody a movable wing on a combat machine weighing tens of tons, which is obliged to withstand colossal loads and not fall apart. The chief stumbling block became the wing pivot. This is the place where the wing attaches to the fuselage and around which it rotates. In flight, this joint endures loads that make any mechanical engineer's hair stand on end. It must be simultaneously movable, so the wing can change its angle, and utterly indestructible, so it does not break under the pressure at supersonic speed. Picture a door hinge that holds the weight of a loaded freight train and yet opens with a single finger. That is roughly the scale of the task. Work on this puzzle was carried out at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute named after Professor Nikolai Yegorovich Zhukovsky. It was there, in Zhukovsky near Moscow, that models were blown through wind tunnels, loads were calculated, and variant after variant was sifted through. The The joint was twisted, loaded, broken on test rigs, and assembled anew. Every miscalculation here meant not a line in a report, but a potential disaster in the air. And at that very same time, on the other end of the planet, American engineers were asking themselves exactly the same questions. In 1964, in the United States, the General Dynamics F-111 took to the air, a tactical bomber with variable wing geometry. The Americans arrived at the same idea independently. Their own calculations, their own wind tunnel runs, their own sleepless nights in design halls. Two superpowers, two utterly different teams, absolute secrecy on both sides, and one and the same answer to one and the same question. In science, this is called convergent evolution, when the very nature of a problem dictates the solution, no matter who takes it on. But behind the outward resemblance hid a fundamental difference. The F-111 was created above all as a tactical machine for operations over comparatively short distances. The Soviet designers, however, set themselves a task of an entirely different caliber, a strategic aircraft capable of working over the ocean, carrying heavy anti-ship armament, and breaking through modern air defenses. The scale of the task was different, and so the scale of the machine had to be different as well. By the end of the 60s, the concept had been worked out, the technical solutions felt out, the contradiction of physics was finally yielding. What remained was the hardest part, to take on the responsibility and begin building in metal. And that responsibility was to fall onto the shoulders of specific people whose names lie ahead. Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev came into the world in 1888. Take a moment to weigh that date. When he was born, the Wright brothers had not yet lifted their first contraption into the air. Aviation itself, as such, did not yet exist. And when he departed this world in 1972, Soviet aviation was one of the two strongest on the planet. An entire epoch of human flight fit into a single biography, and a substantial part of it passed literally through his hands. Over the course of his life, this man designed more than 100 types of flying machines. 100, that is not a misprint, nor a rounding for a tidy figure. 100 different machines, bombers, passenger airliners, torpedo boats, motor sleighs, reconnaissance aircraft. The Tupolev name was carried by the aircraft on which an entire country flew, and by the aircraft the whole world feared. A single designer, an entire continent of aviation. But Tupolev's biography is far from a glossy list of triumphs. It is the story of a man who worked under conditions that are difficult even to wrap one's mind around today. In 1937, at the very height of the political repressions, Andrei Tupolev was taken into custody. The country's finest aircraft designer was charged with high treason. It sounds like an absurdity, but it was the reality in which he spent several years. And here is where the most astonishing part begins. The state that had thrown its best designer behind bars simultaneously handed him a task: to design aircraft. Right there, in confinement. There existed a peculiar form of captivity, the so-called sharashka, a closed design bureau assembled from arrested specialists. Engineers under guard, drafting boards under supervision, brilliant minds behind barbed wire. Within this system, Tupolev went on working. He designed not for the sake of a reward, nor for the sake of a pardon. He designed because it was his calling, because no other choice had been left to him, and because to him aircraft mattered more than any circumstances. At the same drafting board as in freedom, only now under lock and key. A machine emerged from his hand equally precise whether its creator went hungry or was fed, whether he was a free citizen or a man under investigation. Talent did not ask the guards for permission. Years later came rehabilitation, and with it, official recognition. In 1955, Tupolev became general designer. By this moment, several decades of work lay behind him. Early triumphs, arrest, imprisonment, return, the post-war rebuilding of the country's entire aviation industry. A man carrying such a weight on his back looks at any technical problem in an entirely different way, without illusions, without superfluous words, without naive faith that everything will sort itself out on its own. Only the dry essence, what exactly needs to be done and how exactly to achieve it. He had seen too much to waste time on empty talk or handsome gestures, and when his bureau faced the task of creating a machine that united the irreconcilable, it was this very man who took the overall leadership of the project upon himself. It was under his hand that work on the new bomber began. But a general designer sets the direction, shapes the school, answers for the whole, while the day-to-day, everyday labor of bringing a specific machine into being falls onto the shoulders of another man. The one who would lead the project day after day, from blueprint to metal, from the first joint to the rollout onto the runway. And that man became an engineer who had passed through a harsh schooling on earlier, less fortunate projects. This man's name was Dmitry Sergeyevich Markov, chief designer of the Tu-22M project. He had come to the Tupolev Design Bureau as a young engineer and passed through a schooling on several machines in a row, including that very Tu-22, which never became the solution. And here lies his key advantage. Markov knew the failures of the predecessor not from reports and not from other people's accounts. He knew them from the inside. He knew exactly where the machine had fallen short. He knew why the range equation had collapsed. He knew what had turned the aircraft into a nightmare on landing and why it exposed itself to the ship's missiles at the worst possible moment. Every ache of the Tu-22 was recorded in his memory, not as an abstract shortcoming, but as a concrete, hard-earned mistake. And it was precisely this knowledge that became his chief working tool, more valuable than any drafting instrument. Markov's team was handed a task easy to pronounce and nearly impossible to fulfill. To create an aircraft weighing more than 100,000 kilograms when fully equipped, one that takes off from an ordinary concrete runway without demanding circus skill from the pilot, one that behaves predictably at low speeds and forgives mistakes, and one that nonetheless, at high altitude, accelerates to 2,300 kilometers per hour. To grasp what 2,300 kilometers per hour means, let us translate it into something tangible. That is roughly 640 meters per second. In a single second, such a machine covers a distance equal to 6 football fields laid out in a line. At such a speed, only fractions of a second pass between the moment a target appears on the horizon and the moment the aircraft has already torn past it. The eye cannot keep up, the reflexes cannot keep up, only calculation can. And so this 100-ton behemoth had to be made both gentle on takeoff and lightning fast at altitude at one and the same time. Two qualities that physics had driven to opposite sides of the barricade had to be brought together in a single airframe. Behind this task stood no lone genius. Behind it stood the collective of the Design Bureau, several thousand people in that period. Engineers, designers, technologists, calculators, draftsmen, test personnel. Most of them will never be named in any official document. Their labor dissolved into the machine itself, into the blueprints, into the technical solutions, into every rivet and every weld seam of the finished aircraft. Nameless people by whose hands a legend was assembled. Every component later admired began with someone's sleepless night over the calculations, of which history will preserve not a single line. They worked anything but in the quiet of a cozy academic laboratory. The state assignment did not, in principle, allow for the right to fail. Deadlines, rigid, funding, earmarked and strictly controlled down to the last kopeck. Every quarter, a progress report, every deviation from the plan, an explanatory note bearing the personal signature of the supervisor. Over every decision hung a very concrete price of failure. Not a reprimand, not the loss of a bonus, something far weightier in that system of coordinates. And in this vice, between the deadline and the responsibility, between calculation and metal, these people did the impossible as a matter of routine, day after day, and they pulled it off. In 1969, work on the new machine, which had received the closed internal designation Article 4503, entered its final stage. The prototype had been built, the systems checked on test rigs, the engines tested separately. There remained a single step, the most terrifying and the most longed for, to lift this 100-ton machine into the air and find out whether physics had been right or whether Markov's team had been right. On the 30th of August 1969, the aircraft was rolled out onto the runway of the Kazan airfield. The crew took their places. The engines came up to power. What happened next determined the next half-century of Soviet and Russian military aviation. Kazan, August 1969. A city on the banks of the Volga, home to one of the principal aviation plants of the Soviet Union. The Kazan aviation plant already had a long history behind it by then. Aircraft had been built here since the 30s. The walls of these workshops remembered the hard war years, the post-war rebuilding, and the arrival of the jet age. Now, out of those same gates, something the world had never yet seen was being rolled. The prototype of the first modification, later given the clarifying designation Tu-22M3, betrayed a machine of another generation by its silhouette alone. In the spread position, the wing gave a span of more than 34 meters. In the folded position, about 23, a difference of nearly 1.5 times, and it was achieved mechanically, right in flight. The aircraft could change its own geometry in the air, like a living creature spreading and folding its wings. At the controls of the first prototype sat test pilot Vasily Petrovich Borisov. The profession of test pilot cannot be described in ordinary words. He is the man who first climbs into a machine about which no one on Earth yet knows how it will behave in the air. All the calculations are done, all the test rigs passed, all the joints checked on the ground. But calculation and reality are two different universes, and who, if not the test pilot, knows this best of all? On the morning of the 30th of August, the warming of the engines took its allotted time, not a second less. On the ground stood, frozen in place, the members of the State Commission, the engineers, the designers. Among them stood Dmitry Markov as well. People who had given several years of their lives to this machine now simply stood and watched. There was nothing more for them to do. Everything that depended on their hands and their minds had already been done and was now rolling along the concrete on its own wheels. The aircraft began its takeoff run. A long concrete runway, the rising roar of 2 turbojet engines. A machine massing more than 100,000 kilograms gathered speed, and those who stood by the runway felt that sound not with their ears. They felt it with their whole bodies. This is not a rumble. This is pressure. The physical pressure of sound waves striking the chest from within. The air trembled. The concrete vibrated, and within this rising roar, the fate of 8 years of work was being decided. The wheels left the runway. The machine climbed. In the air, Borisov began to carry out the program, maneuver after maneuver, strictly according to the assignment. The culmination was the test of the main thing, the change of wing sweep right in flight. The mechanism that was to work thousands of hours under the most varied conditions operated for the first time exactly as it had been calculated on paper. The wing folded, the wing spread, and throughout all this, the aircraft kept flying steadily without losing control. The flight lasted about half an hour. When the machine came into land and the wheels touched the runway once more, those on the ground let out their breath. Not because they had seriously expected a disaster, but because the first liftoff of any new aircraft is always the moment when years of labor are compressed and tested within 30 minutes. And those 30 minutes always stretch out agonizingly long for those left below. Borisov taxied to the apron. The engines fell silent, and a sudden quiet hung over the airfield. The pilot threw back the canopy and climbed out of the cockpit. Markov was the first to walk up to him. "Alive?" he asked tersely. Borisov was silent for a second. not because he did not know the answer, but because such moments do not tolerate haste. "Alive," he said. And that single word was enough. But a first flight is not a finish line. It is only the start of a long road that in aviation is called the test program. The machine had yet to be wrung out to the limit, checked at extreme regimes, its armament tried out, its boundaries felt for, where the possible ends and where the permissible ends. The main thing the tests showed at once: the concept works. Variable sweep on a machine of this class was no longer theory, but a reality made of metal. Yet they showed a second thing as well. To a combat aircraft, the road was still very long. The first prototype was, to put it bluntly, raw. The engines did not deliver the calculated thrust. The avionics demanded serious reworking. A whole range of systems operated unstably, capriciously, not as had been intended. The engineers returned to their drafting boards. Thus began a road nearly 8 years long, from the first liftoff of the prototype to that very machine the whole world would come to know under the name Tu-22M3. In aviation, there is an unspoken rule: the first machine is never the last. This is not a flaw of the system, but the very nature of complex technology. Only an actual flight reveals where calculation matched reality and where it diverged from it mercilessly, and that divergence becomes the raw material for the next step. The Tu-22M0 prototype had shown the main thing. The direction had been chosen correctly, but an enormous amount of work still lay ahead. It had to begin with the most painful spot: the engines. The prototype carried the NK-144, an uprated version of the engines originally created for the supersonic passenger airliner Tu-144. The decision was a forced one. The necessary engines were simply not at hand, so they took what was available. But these engines did not deliver the thrust a combat machine demanded. They were heavier than the norm and devoured too much fuel. And fuel, for an aircraft honed to operate over the ocean, is no secondary line in a table. It is the very meaning of its existence. Every extra kilogram of consumption ate up precious kilometers of range, the very ones for which the whole thing had been started. In parallel, other ailments came to light. The variable sweep mechanism worked, but the attachment joints needed refinement. At certain regimes, vibrations arose that the calculations had not predicted. The radar equipment was due to be replaced with something more modern. In 1971, the first reworked modification entered production, the Tu-22M1. At first it was presented as an experimental specimen, but already after its handover to the military, it became clear. This was still a transitional model. It was built in a limited series, about 9 machines. These aircraft mostly continued the test program and refined tactical procedures. But the chief result of this stage lay not in the machines themselves. The engineers had grasped, once and for all, without fundamentally new engines, moving further was pointless. This heart was taken on by the design bureau of Nikolai Dmitrievich Kuznetsov, one of the leading Soviet masters of engine building. And here is a detail that says more about the caliber of the team than any words. It was engines of Kuznetsov's design that stood on the giant N-1 carrier rocket within the Soviet lunar program. The very people who created engines for the conquest of the moon now had to give Markov's aircraft a heart worthy of its airframe. In 1972, the Tu-22M2 modification appeared. This was now a genuinely serious machine, not a refinement prototype. The new engines provided a marked increase in thrust. The navigation system was completely reworked. The weapons control system improved. The aircraft received a new sighting complex, which allowed missiles to be employed appreciably more accurately. The cockpit was recut anew, taking into account all the remarks accumulated by pilots over the years of testing. The Tu-22M2 was produced in a far broader series. about 211 units. It entered service with aviation regiments and went into operation under conditions close to combat. But the engineers did not allow themselves to stop for a single day. The adversary on the far side of the ocean was not dozing either. The fleet of the United States was growing stronger, and shipboard air defense was improving year by year. Anti-aircraft systems on carriers and escort ships received new radars, more sophisticated guidance algorithms, and ever-growing engagement range. Every reinforcement on the American side demanded a symmetrical answer on the Soviet one, and that answer was already being born on the drafting boards. On the 20th of June, 1977, over the Kazan airfield, rose a machine that became the final solution to all the tasks accumulated over 8 years. This was the Tu-22M3, the third and final principal modification, the very one the West would award a nickname that became a household word. The changes compared to its predecessor were not cosmetic, but fundamental. In place of the former engines, the NK-25 was installed, yielding a substantial increase in thrust on afterburner. The top speed leapt to 2,300 kilometers per hour against 1,800 for the Tu-22M2. New, reworked air intakes appeared, more efficient at high speeds. The sighting and navigation complex was completely updated, and a new electronic countermeasure system was added. The combat load reached 24,000 kilograms. The practical range without refueling, about 7,000 kilometers. The combat radius with maximum load, on the order of 2,400 kilometers. The task that in the late 60s had seemed a mockery of physics was now solved, and solved with a margin to spare. The good had become the best. What remained was to understand exactly what made the heart of this machine beat, and that deserved a separate conversation. The two NK-25 engines are a product deserving a separate conversation. To understand what goes on inside them, let us start with something simple. Picture an ordinary campfire of dry logs, and now set against it a powerful pump that drives a jet of compressed air into the flame. The fire will blaze brighter, the temperature will leap up, energy will start releasing in an avalanche. The principle of the jet engine is exactly the same, only on a monstrous scale. Replace the campfire with a stream of kerosene. The pump, with the compressor of a turbojet engine. The wooden frame, with a combustion chamber of heat-resistant alloys. And now add an afterburner, a separate section behind the main turbine, into which additional fuel is injected straight into the white-hot stream of exhaust gases. The temperature in this chamber on afterburner climbs past 1,500 degrees Celsius. This is the NK-25 in all its fury. The engine was developed at the design bureau of Nikolai Kuznetsov in the city of Kuibyshev, which today bears the name Samara. The work proceeded in parallel with the refinement of the aircraft itself. Kuznetsov's engineers labored to make the engine run reliably across an unthinkably wide range of conditions. From takeoff on a baking airfield, where the air is heated to +40, to cruising flight at an altitude of 13,000 meters, where outside it is -55 or even -60. One and the same unit had to endure both of these infernos with equal steadiness. A single NK-25 engine at maximum afterburner delivers a thrust of about 245 kilonewtons. And on the Tu-22M3, there are two of them. Together, on afterburner, this yields on the order of 490 kilonewtons. So, as not to deal in abstraction, let us translate that into the familiar. 490 kilonewtons is roughly the force with which 50,000 kilograms press down on a scale. 100 tons of pure force, shoving the machine forward. It is precisely this force that accelerates a craft massing 124,000 kilograms to a speed twice that of sound. At high altitude, sound travels at around 1,060 kilometers per hour. The ratio of an aircraft's speed to the speed of sound is called the Mach number, and so the Tu-22M3 at high altitude reaches a Mach number of 2.1. In other words, it flies almost twice as fast as sound spreads through the air around it. What this means in practice must be understood without distortion. At such a speed, the machine outruns its own sound. An observer on the ground first sees the aircraft, and only afterward, with a delay, hears it. The famous sonic boom, that sharp crack as a supersonic machine passes overhead, is not the roar of the engines at all. It is the sonic cone, a shock wave of compressed air that the aircraft drags behind it, like the spreading wave behind a ship's bow. But the sonic boom is what falls to those who remain outside. Inside, on the very skin of the machine, an entirely different drama unfolds. At a speed of around 2,300 kilometers per hour, the air before the nose simply does not have time to part. It is compressed, and that compression instantly turns into heat. The nose radome, the leading edges of the wing, the engine air intakes, all of it, at full afterburner, heats up to a temperature on the order of 100 to 120 degrees Celsius. This is not metal glowing red hot in the dark. This is simply hot metal. But lay your palm against it at such a speed, and the burn will be instant. The fuselage itself, in flight, literally expands from the heating by several centimeters, physically becoming longer than it is on the apron. And this is no defect, no miscalculation. It is built into the design from the start. The engineers foresaw thermal expansion and left the metal room to grow. Put it all together, and the image of the machine takes on flesh. 100 tons of thrust, exhaust hotter than 1,500 degrees, a speed that outruns sound, and skin heated so that it cannot be touched. This is the price the structure pays for supersonic flight. But behind this scorching armor, mere centimeters from the inferno of speed heating, were 3 living men. And what they experienced is a wholly different story. The cockpit of the Tu-22M3 accommodates 3 men: the crew commander, the navigator-operator, and the weapons systems operator. Their workplace is an ejection-equipped seat, instrument panels, screens, and control handles surrounding them on every side. The cockpit is pressurized. The air conditioning system holds normal pressure and a familiar temperature, walling the men off from what is happening outside. But physics cannot be fooled, and it reminds them of this constantly. On going to afterburner, the G-load presses the crew into their seats. Not abruptly, not with a jolt, but smoothly and relentlessly, as if someone's enormous palm settles on top and slowly increases its push. In a vigorous maneuver at high speed, the G-load reaches several units. And here is where the figures turn into pure physiology. Every unit of G-load is the additional weight of one's own body, multiplied by itself. Let us count without embellishment. At a G-load of 3, a man who weighs 80 kilograms on the ground feels as though he carries 240. The arms grow heavy, the head fills with lead, every movement comes only with effort. And in this state, the crew is obliged not merely to endure, but to work, precisely, with full focus, with no right to error. The body screams about the overload, while the hands go on guiding the machine and its systems. The noise in the cockpit is a trial of its own. Even with the canopy closed and a flight helmet on, this is no background hum that can be pushed to the edge of awareness. It is a constant, dense presence, pressing on the nerves hour after hour. The vibration runs through the entire structure of the aircraft, through the seat, through the control handle. The pilot's hands literally read with their fingers every change in the engine regime. The machine speaks to the crew in the language of tremor and roar, and beyond the thin wall of the cockpit lies another world, utterly hostile to a human being. At cruising altitude, it is minus 55 degrees outside. Inside it is a normal, livable temperature at which one can breathe and work. Between these two worlds, only a few centimeters of skin and the glass of the canopy. a thin border between life and the icy void of the stratosphere, which is separated from the human being by engineering calculation alone. Pilots who trained on this machine repeated the same thing almost word for word. The Tu-22M3 demands full presence. Not 90% of attention, not 95, exactly 100. In this cockpit there is no room for extraneous thoughts, no room for weary relaxation, no room for a single superfluous second of distraction. The machine senses the slightest slackness and reminds you of it at once, without waiting for a second chance, and everything spoken of until now is merely the means of delivery. The scorching skin, the roar of the engines, the G-load driving the body into the seat, all of it serves one single purpose. The main question always sounded different and far harsher. What exactly does this machine carry to its target? What hides in its bays and on its pylons, for the sake of which 3 men endure G-load and cold behind the thin wall of the cockpit? It was the answer to this question that turned the Tu-22M3 from merely a fast aircraft into a nightmare for an entire fleet. There are aircraft that are weapons in themselves, and there are aircraft platforms, means of delivering a strike to the point of use. The Tu-22M3 belongs to the second type, but it proved to be such a monstrous platform that the boundary between these notions blurred almost to the point of indistinction. Let us begin with the main caliber, the KH-22 missile. In documents and reference books it goes by the name Buria, the Tempest. And this is not a pretty word for effect, but an exact description of what begins after its launch. The KH-22 was developed from the late 50s at the design bureau of Alexander Yakovlevich Bereznyuk. The task was set in the harshest terms: to create a missile capable of striking a large surface ship, first and foremost an aircraft carrier, from such a distance that the carrier aircraft itself remained outside the zone of the ship's air defense. This requirement defined the entire shape of the device, and the shape came out colossal. Take a moment to weigh the dimensions. The length of the missile is about 11.6 meters. That is the height of roughly a 4-story residential building laid out horizontally beneath the belly of the aircraft. The wingspan is on the order of 3 meters. The launch mass is about 5,900 kilograms, nearly 6 tons. 6 tons is the weight of roughly 4 mid-class passenger cars, and the Tu-22M3 carries this giant on an external mount, on the central pylon beneath the fuselage, takes off with it, accelerates, and rolls out onto the attack course. The missile's engine is a liquid fuel rocket type. After release from the carrier, the KH-22 accelerates to a speed of about 4,000 kilometers per hour. That is roughly a Mach number of 3.6, meaning the missile itself flies appreciably faster than the aircraft that launched it. The launch range, depending on the modification and the regime, runs from 140 to 600 kilometers, and that means the carrier can strike while sitting far beyond the horizon from its target. Here is the whole cruelty of the design. The ship's radars, at the moment of launch, may not see the aircraft at all. It is below the line of the horizon. They will detect only the missile itself, already torn from its pylon and bearing down on the target, and by the time they detect it, it is already too late. On approach to the ship, the KH-22 descends toward the water and travels the final stretch of its trajectory literally at the surface of the sea. A low-flying target at a speed exceeding 4,000 kilometers per hour is a nearly insoluble problem for any defense system of that era. The missile's warhead, by various accounts, weighed about 900 to 1,000 kilograms. In the variant for striking ground objects, a special type of warhead could be installed, the details of which were not disclosed in open sources. A single such hit was enough to disable or send to the bottom a ship of the very largest class, one aircraft, one missile, and the fate of a carrier hung by a thread. But the KH-22 was not the only trump card. The second became the K-15 missile, a development of the Raduga Design Bureau in the city of Dubna. The concept here is an entirely different one. If the Kh-22 is a heavy battering ram from long range, then the Kh-15 is speed and surprise in their purest form. The missile is markedly smaller, a length of about 4.8 meters, a launch mass on the order of 1,200 kilograms. In exchange, the speed after launch reaches a Mach number of 5. That is about 6,000 kilometers per hour. To intercept such a target by the air defense means of that period was practically impossible in principle. The Kh-15 was produced in several variants, an anti-radar one, for suppressing the enemy's radar stations, and a strike one, for hitting ground and surface targets. The Tu-22M3 could carry up to 6 such missiles on an internal rotary launcher, plus additional ones on the external mounts. 6 missiles, each 5 times faster than sound, fired in a nearly simultaneous salvo. To cope with such a simultaneous flood of targets, the defenses of that time were in principle unable. They were simply swamped. And now let us gather it all into a single final image. The maximum combat load of the Tu-22M3 is 24,000 kilograms, 24 tons. That is the weight of roughly 16 passenger cars, or, in terms of free-falling bombs, several dozen aerial bombs of the 500-kilogram caliber placed in the bomb bays and on the external mounts. 1 aircraft, 3 men in the cockpit, and 24 tons of destructive cargo aboard. When in the West they began to assemble this picture from scattered data, the calm in the command rooms came to an end. The machine was about to receive a name, and that name would be spoken with apprehension. In the system of code designations of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, every Soviet aircraft received a name in the English language. The logic was dry and clerical. Bombers, words beginning with the letter B. Fighters, beginning with the letter F. Transports, beginning with the letter C. A convenient classification for officers and analysts who had to deal daily with foreign, closed-off hardware. To the new Soviet bomber with variable wing sweep was assigned the designation Backfire. In literal translation, reverse fire, and if one seeks a more precise equivalent in meaning, fire that strikes back. The name proved frighteningly apt. The machine was indeed a counterstrike, a steel objection to the dominance of American carrier groups. The West itself, without realizing it, had picked the truest definition for it. The first data on the new aircraft Western intelligence services began to receive in the early 70s. The sources were of the most varied kinds: satellite images of airfields, intercepted communications, agent reports. The picture took shape slowly, like a mosaic that at first has only a few corner fragments. Analysts of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency worked with these crumbs methodically and stubbornly. The wingspan was calculated from satellite images. The placement of the engines was fixed. The length of the fuselage was reckoned by comparing the silhouette with known objects on the airfield. But one parameter kept slipping away and remained the subject of furious argument for several years running: the flight range. And it was precisely around this figure that one of the tensest diplomatic confrontations of the entire Cold War unfolded. In 1972, the Soviet Union and the United States signed the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Arms, the first of its kind. It limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but strategic aviation did not enter into it. The parties put off that heavy question for later. Later arrived in 1974, when negotiations on the second treaty began, and here the American side put the question point blank. The Tu-22M3 must be included in the list of limited strategic systems. Washington's logic ran thus: if the aircraft is capable of reaching the territory of the United States from Soviet territory, even one way without return, then it is a strategic carrier, and its number must be limited. They tried to enroll the machine in the same category as intercontinental missiles. The Soviet side objected firmly and on principle. The official position stated, "The Tu-22M3 is a medium-range aircraft intended for operations in the European theater and over the adjacent seas, not intercontinental." Not strategic in the sense the Americans invested in that word. The dispute dragged on for years, at the level of ministers, at the level of heads of state, in the negotiating halls of Geneva. In 1979, the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Arms, the second, was at last signed. The Tu-22M3 never did make it onto the list of strategic carriers. Here, Soviet diplomacy held its ground, but the price of the compromise was nonetheless paid. The Soviet side took on obligations to limit production of the aircraft to 30 machines per year and not to equip it with an aerial refueling probe. The refueling probe is a small retractable tube in the nose section through which the aircraft takes on fuel from a tanker in flight. A detail modest in appearance, but it is precisely this that multiplies the practical range. On the early modifications of the Tu-22M, it was present. On the production Tu-22M3, it was dismantled, exactly as the fulfillment of an undertaken political obligation. Diplomats clipped the machine's wings with the stroke of the pen without touching the metal itself. But while in the Geneva halls they argued over probes and ranges, American military planners went about their craft. The doctrine for deploying carrier strike groups was revised. Carriers began to be kept farther from the probable operating zones of Soviet naval aviation. The calculation was simple and cold. If the combat radius of the Tu-22M3 is about 2,400 kilometers, then a carrier group must, under any circumstances, remain beyond the edge of that circle. One aircraft changed the geography of the American fleet. This is no resounding metaphor. It is a documented fact of military planning. The North Atlantic, the Norwegian Sea, the Mediterranean, regions where American carriers had previously sailed almost freely, now demanded a separate reckoning of threats. In every operational plan, a separate line appeared: the threat posed by Soviet long-range naval missile-carrying aviation. The very fact that a single machine became the subject of treaties at the highest level and the cause of doctrine revisions speaks of it more loudly than any tabular characteristics. Behind all the doctrines and treaties, it is easy to overlook one simple circumstance. Every time this machine rose into the sky, 3 living men sat in its cockpit. Not an abstract, long-range threat from NATO summaries, but 3 specific people. Test pilot Borisov lifted the first prototype effectively alone, in the sense that it was his hands that held the controls. But the combat Tu-22M3 does not fly that way. It is a crude machine, and 3 lead it at the controls. 3 different specialties, 3 different views on one and the same flight. The first is the crew commander. His place is the left front seat. Before him is an instrument panel with dozens of indicators, the control handle, the pedals, the engine control levers. The commander answers for the machine as a whole, for the takeoff, for the flight along the route, for the landing, for the decisions made in fractions of a second that have no right to turn out wrong. On a machine like this, a second's hesitation costs an exorbitant price. The training of a Tu-22M3 commander stretched over years. First the flight schools, then training and transitional types, and only afterward, the gradual mastering of the machine itself. First with an instructor, then on one's own. By the moment of clearance for independent flights, the total flight time was reckoned in the hundreds of hours. And still the machine did not forgive complacency. Even the most experienced pilot it reminded of who was in charge here at the very first slackening. The second man is the navigator-operator, the right front seat. His kingdom is navigation. At every moment of the flight he is obliged to know the exact location of the aircraft, to calculate the course, to watch the fuel consumption, to hold to the timing parameters of the route to the second. And here is the figure that sends a chill down the spine. On a machine traveling at a speed of more than 2,000 kilometers per hour, a navigational error of just 1 minute is a deviation from the course of more than 30 kilometers. 30 kilometers off to the side for 1 single minute of inattention. At supersonic speed, there is no right to distraction, not even for an instant. The navigator worked with a complex navigation suite, an inertial navigation system, radio navigation equipment, astronavigation instruments. And here is what is astonishing. Under conditions of radio silence, when communications and radio navigation were forbidden for reasons of stealth, the navigator led the machine by the stars and by inertial sensors, exactly as seafarers led their ships several centuries ago. Only now, at a speed those navigators could not have dreamed of even in their boldest dream. The most ancient art of navigating by the heavenly bodies met here the utmost technology of the 20th century. The third man is the weapons systems operator, the rear seat. His finest hour comes when the others have already done their work and brought the machine to the line of employment. Now it is his turn. The radar sighting complex, the target lock, the calculation of the launch moment, the command to employ the weapon, and all of this in a situation where the aircraft may be performing evasive maneuvers, where the enemy is laying down active electronic jamming, where the reckoning runs in seconds. 3 men in one cramped cockpit, and yet each exists in his own professional world, wholly absorbed in his own task. The coordination of such a crew was built up over years of joint flights. Pilots who had served together for several years understood one another without words, by a change in the tone of voice over the intercom, by the character of movements in the cockpit, by the way someone reached for the needed switch a touch faster than usual. This is no handsome exaggeration, but the professional reality of long-range aviation crews. Flights on the Tu-22M3 were physically hard, without any allowances. A combat sortie, counting the route, the run into the line, and the return to base, lasted several hours. Several hours in a row in an ejection-equipped seat, in an oxygen mask, at high altitude, in the unceasing noise of the engines and under the burden of responsibility for the machine and for the men alongside. Long-range aviation pilots rarely speak of this publicly. The professional culture does not allow for complaints. But in the few interviews that did occur, the veterans named one and the same feeling: respect for the machine. Not fear and not sentimental attachment, but precisely respect, as towards something that demands full dedication and answers in kind. One of the veterans, who flew the Tu-22M3 in the 80s, described it thus: "You take your seat, and the machine senses it. If you are not ready, it will tell you so in the very first minutes. Not in words, but it will tell you." These relations between a man and an aircraft cannot be written into any technical manual, nor expressed by any tabular figures. And everything that has been spoken of, the training, the doctrine, the exercises, was merely a prelude. The real test comes when the conditions cease to be those of training. And this test came to the Tu-22M3 over the mountains. Over very specific mountains, over Afghanistan, a mountainous country in the very heart of Asia, where the average elevation of the terrain is about 1,800 meters above sea level, and individual ridges rear up to 7,000. The narrow valleys between them, now several kilometers wide, now only a few hundred meters. The air is thin, the turbulence unpredictable, the weather changes within minutes. This was a landscape for which the machine had not been designed in principle. The Tu-22M3 was born for a different element, for the open, boundless expanses of the North Atlantic, where the endless water merges with the horizon. It was created for the hunt of carrier strike groups on the open ocean, where there are no landmarks, no settlements, no tight passages between cliffs. In that environment, the machine felt utterly confident, unfolding its full potential across wide and predictable spaces. The Afghan mountains turned out to be the complete opposite of that design intent. The Air Force of the Soviet Union began to employ the Tu-22M3 in Afghanistan in 1988, in the closing stage of the Soviet troop presence in the country. The task was set in terms that aviators call area work. This is the delivery of bomb strikes against extensive zones in the highlands from a great altitude. And here, at its full height, a quality of the machine manifested itself that is usually not the first to be recalled: its imposing practical ceiling. The theoretical ceiling of the Tu-22M3 was 13,000 meters, 13 kilometers above sea level. At such an altitude, the aircraft flew above most Afghan ridges and, what is far more important, above the zone of effective action of the man-portable surface-to-air missile systems the opposing side possessed. In effect, it was beyond the reach of those means of countering that were available to the adversary under those conditions. Altitude became its armor, but that same altitude bred difficulties of its own. Aimed bombing from 10 to 13,000 meters is not at all the same as a strike from 500. A bomb dropped from such a height is in free fall for several dozen seconds, and over those seconds it is carried off to the side from the release point by the wind, which at different altitudes blows at different speeds and in different directions. One and the same release at different levels gave a different drift. To calculate the release point with a correction for all these layers of wind is a task of the highest complexity, demanding the joint work of the sighting complex and the navigator. And yet, the sighting and navigation complex of the Tu-22M3 had been designed above all for the employment of missile armament, not for high-altitude bombing against mountain targets. And so, new tactical procedures had to be worked out right in the course of combat work. This is what in aviation is called the mastering of combat experience, a science written not in an office, but in the sky. The crews returned to base, conducted debriefings of the sorties, analyzed the results, corrected the methodology, and rose into the air again. The flight time accumulated under Afghan conditions proved truly unique. The mountainous terrain bred turbulence on the approach to the bombing zones. The thin air altered the aerodynamics at low speeds, though at high altitudes the machine scarcely noticed this. And the summer heat at the intermediate Afghan airfields struck at the takeoff characteristics. Hot air is less dense, and so holds the machine more poorly and lengthens the takeoff run. Each of these factors became a separate line in the flight manuals, which were rewritten on the basis of real sorties. One of the officers who took part in those missions later recalled it thus: "The first thing that struck you when working over the Afghan terrain was the silence in the cockpit before the run-in to the release line. And this silence was not because there was nothing to say. It was because at that critical instant, each crew member was occupied solely with his own task, without a single superfluous word. The machine and the men, in that second, acted as a single, finely tuned mechanism. Here it is, the highest assessment of a crew's coordination, not a certificate, not an entry in a service record, but this very silence in which each knows his own task by heart. Coordination brought to the point where words become superfluous. The Afghan experience gave engineers and tacticians what could not be obtained on any testing range. It showed where the machine worked exactly as intended and where it demanded refinement. And by the moment the last Soviet aircraft left the Afghan sky in 1989, the Tu-22M3 had passed a test that no technical specification had provided for. It coped. But behind this trial, another was already advancing, an incomparably heavier one, and it came not from the enemy's sky, but from within. In 1991, the world in which this machine had been born simply ceased to exist. The Soviet Union fell apart, and along with it, into 2, into 3, into 15 pieces dispersed everything it had built: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the factories, the debts, and the assets of an entire power. 15 new states divided among themselves the inheritance of an enormous country. This was not merely a political process. It was the dismantling of an entire civilization, with all its hardware, its infrastructure, and its people. The aviation fleets were divided by a simple territorial principle. Those aircraft that, at the moment of the breakup, happened to be at a particular airfield remained with the republic on whose soil they stood. Part of the Tu-22M3 machines went to Ukraine, part to Russia, part to other former republics. A single military organism, built up over decades, in one stroke broke into scattered fragments, many of which no longer had either a common command or a common logistics. What followed was only harder. The funding of the Russian armed forces in the 90s collapsed to such a degree that the mere maintenance of complex aviation equipment in working order turned into a feat for the technical services. There were not enough spare parts. Fuel was issued in paltry quantities. Pilots' flight time fell to marks that in Soviet years would have been considered an outright emergency. The sky was emptying. There was nothing to fly on and nothing to fly. Under these conditions, a great many aviation systems of the Soviet era quietly left the stage. And they departed not from enemy fire, and not because something more advanced had come to replace them. They departed because there was simply nothing left to sustain them with. Machines were laid up, cut up for scrap, written off by entire regiments. Against this backdrop, the Tu-22M3 held its ground, and that in itself requires explanation. Behind its survival stand three quite concrete reasons. First, no equivalent replacement was to be found for the machine. Russian long-range aviation rested on several key types of aircraft, and the Tu-22M3 occupied an entirely special niche within it. It was a naval missile carrier and a long-range bomber at one and the same time, and there was simply nothing with which to substitute it. And the development of a new machine of this class in the impoverished 90s was financially impossible. To write it off would have meant leaving an entire field without its instrument. Second, the colossal margin of strength laid in at construction came into play. The Kazan aviation plant assembled the Tu-22M3 to the highest quality. The airframe possessed an imposing service life, and with competent maintenance the machine could fly for decades without a major rework of the structure. What Markov's engineers had laid into the metal back in the 70s now, in an age of penury, turned into salvation. Strength calculated with a margin outlived the country that had ordered it. Third, and this is perhaps the chief thing, the people came into play. The technical specialists who serviced these machines managed to preserve the continuity of knowledge through the hardest period. Experience was passed from the older generation to the younger. Not always officially, not always by the textbooks, sometimes simply in conversation, in the hangar, at a particular unit of a particular aircraft. This was a living transfer of mastery, which cannot be digitized and which is so easy to sever forever. But it was not severed. The chain did not break, the knowledge did not dissolve, the hands did not forget their skill. And it was precisely thanks to this interlocking of three reasons, irreplaceability, strength, and human continuity, that the machine held on until better times. And the better times did, after all, arrive. In the 2000s, when the funding of the Russian armed forces began little by little to recover, a new chapter opened for the Tu-22M3, a stage toward which it had, in essence, been moving across the whole age of stagnation. A deep modernization. The chance to take a machine born in the 70s and give it what in the 70s had not existed at all. An aircraft whose first prototype tore off the Kazan runway when computing technology filled entire halls was to receive the avionics of an altogether different century. And what it became after this renewal gives reason to ponder the very nature of longevity in technology. The modernized variant received the designation Tu-22M3M. The letter M at the end stands for modernized, the standard mark of an updated version in the Russian aviation tradition. But behind this modest letter hid an almost complete reassembly of the machine's electronic innards. An aircraft born in the 70s was receiving the avionics of the 21st century, and this was no cosmetic touch-up, but a change of the very nervous system. Here is exactly what changed inside. A fundamentally new sighting and navigation complex appeared, built on a modern component base. The analog flight control systems gave way to digital ones. The machine was made compatible with new generation precision cruise missiles, and its electronic countermeasures were updated. In the cockpit, in place of the dial indicators of the Soviet era, new instruments took their stand. The airframe, meanwhile, remained the same, that very one, calculated with a margin backed by Markov's team. On the outside, almost the same machine. On the inside, an aircraft that began to speak with modern systems in their own digital language. The first modernized airframe rose into the air on the 16th of December, 2018, almost half a century after the first prototype tore off the Kazan runway in '69. 50 years in service. For a combat machine, this is a span bordering on the incredible. To truly feel this distance, let us return to the year of the first flight. When in 1969 the prototype first tore off the concrete, a human being had not yet set foot on the surface of the moon. That happened only a few weeks later, in July of the same year. Since then, several generations of computing technology have come and gone. Telephones have traveled the road from utter absence in the pocket to a supercomputer in the palm. The internet has recut the very fabric of human civilization, and the machine still flies. And this is no stubborn conservatism, no unwillingness to part with the old. It is proof that the fundamental engineering solutions laid into the design at the end of the 60s proved so correct that time itself was unable to render them obsolete. The variable wing sweep still works effectively. The layout of the airframe is still aerodynamically perfect. The concept of the long-range missile carrier is still in demand by the sky. Andrei Tupolev did not live to see this modification. He left this world in 1972, 5 years before the first flight of the Tu-22M3 itself, and decades before its digital rebirth. But he managed to see the main thing. The path chosen by his design bureau had been the right one. Dmitry Markov, under whose day-to-day leadership the machine was born, lived long enough to see how his labor outlived the very epic that had given rise to it. And here it is, that very answer for whose sake it was worth traveling this whole road from the year 49 to our own days. The story of the Tu-22M3 is not at all a story of steel and kerosene. It is a story of what happens when people take on a task that physics has declared impossible and do not retreat. When engineers work under colossal pressure and find solutions that afterward prove almost eternal. When pilots take their seat in the cockpit and build with the machine relations that will fit into no manual. The aircraft is merely the material embodiment of this human persistence. There are machines that honestly serve out their term, take off, fly, land, and quietly depart into museum halls and archival summaries. And there are those that themselves become an epic, that outlive the countries that created them, that are modernized and lifted into the sky when their writing off was long ago foretold. That force the revision of military doctrines and enter into the lines of international treaties. The Tu-22M3 is of the second breed, without any reservations. And not at all because it is the fastest ever built, nor because it is the only one of its kind, but because behind every weld seam of its fuselage, behind every bolt in the wing pivot, behind every line of its onboard documentation stand people who believed in one simple and indestructible thought. The impossible is merely that which has not yet been done. They did it, and the machine flies to this day. Thank you for watching. If this story of the steel giant and the people who lifted it into the sky has gripped you, support the channel. Leave a like under this video. For you, it is a single motion. But for us, it is a signal that material like this is needed and worth pouring our strength into. Subscribe to the channel so you do not lose us in the general stream, and be sure to tap the bell. Then you will be the first to learn of new episodes about legendary machines, secret developments, and the hidden pages of military aviation. Ahead lie many more stories that were not told aloud for a long time. Until we meet again in the sky.